All right, everybody, welcome to the Your Freedom Hub presentation with our guest today. You're going to have some exciting news to talk about. So here we are talking about cash patients and cash doctors. I'm your host, Jeff Cantor with Charles Frohman. We do have these all archived and give you a chance to find out and become involved in getting these on a regular basis. These are the web addresses. They are case sensitive. And to give you a little flavor, let's zip over and take a peek here at what one of these would look like. Here's we were sitting. You'll see there's a nice collection of them building up. We actually have an older repository at that other link, but you're going to want to come and share these, and this particular one will be posted in short order as well. So again, we're glad that you're here today. So on that note, I would like to let you see who's here today. So Charles, if you'll do the honors.
Gladly, Jeff, and welcome Dr. Edelstein. And we're very pleased to talk about mental health because, and Dr. Edelstein can correct me if I'm wrong, and he may, because in our literature that Jeff and I are into as we're disrupting healthcare, we read all the time that there's growing demand for mental health benefits in workplaces. And that may or may not be true, but it seems to be a question that always comes up when talking to families or small businesses about their healthcare. So in our weekly Cash Patient webinar, we always seek the best innovators in health every week. So for a mental health night, Dr. Edelstein is well known in the therapy space, particularly because of his bestseller, 3-Minute Therapy. And that's a great title. And in this day and age, people are looking for quick solutions. So if you can't like a therapy that takes just 3 minutes, then you're probably hopeless. But Dr. Edelstein has been doing clinical psychology since the 1980s. He was educated at Yeshiva University, and he has a politics too that informs his psychological practice that we may get into later on. We always want to talk about the disruption in markets, and that always gets a bit political. The 3-Minute Therapy book of Dr. Edelstein's is based on the writings and practice of Dr. Albert Ellis, the father of what's called Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy, Cognitive Behavior Therapy, and Cognitive Therapy. So if those are phrases foreign to some of us, well, we'll learn tonight, Jeff, what Dr. Edelstein has to say about those. And that's your introduction.
So, as you mentioned, the type of therapy I do is called Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy, and it was devised by a pioneering psychologist and genius in the 50s named Albert Ellis, as you mentioned. And Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy, or REBT, is based on a few simple premises with profound ramifications. And the first premise is that our emotions don't come from situations themselves. So if I get fired and I'm depressed, most people would say, well, of course you're depressed, you got fired. But that's not how we work psychologically. The way we work psychologically is it's never, ever situations that create our emotions. There's no direct connection from situations, events, experiences into our emotions, but rather it's our thinking about those situations that cause our emotions. So for example, if I'm fired and I'm depressed, it's because of my thinking about being fired, such as, this is really bad news. How am I going to pay my rent? This must not happen to me. It's the end of the world. I'm going to be unemployed, maybe homeless. This is terrible. And it's that kind of thinking that leads me to feel depressed, not the situation. Obviously, some people might be happy to be fired. They're finally relieved of this onerous job and they have some free time, etc. So they view it differently. So it's always our thinking always go back to our thinking. Now, this is a very powerful idea, because if it's your thinking that causes your emotions, and if you have undesirable or disturbed thinking or undesirable disturbed emotions, it's not necessary to change the situation to get over these emotions. I don't have to get a job immediately before I can feel undepressed, but rather identify my unreasonable, or what we call in REBT, irrational thinking, and then question, challenge it, contradict it, and change our perspective to a perspective of accepting what we don't like, unconditionally accepting problems and hassles in life, which we better do, since we're always going to have problems and hassles in life, even if we have a job, and that will help us dramatically. So that's 3-minute therapy in a nutshell. Now, an interesting thing about this first premise, that it's our thinking that causes our emotions, most people don't seem to realize this. So if you listen to people about situations they're in and the feelings that they have, they almost always say the situation or the adversity caused my emotion. For example, the reason I'm stressed is because I'm going to be late for the deadline at work. Or the reason I'm depressed is because I'm getting fired from one job or another after another. Or the reason I'm jealous is because I found out my mate is cheating on me. So if you notice, in all those situations, the responsibility is put on the situation, not on one's thinking. So when someone learns that it's a matter of unreasonable thinking that's causing the emotions, then they have the tools, or the beginning of the tools, to change their emotion by analyzing their thinking and seeing if it's realistic, by asking, what's the evidence for my idea that it's the end of the world if I lose my job? What is the evidence this proves I'll never get another job? What is the evidence I can't stand being unemployed and having the extra financial burdens? And so they analyze the thinking, look for the evidence, like a little scientist. Scientists set up hypotheses and look for the evidence to support those hypotheses. And then hopefully they're able to see, at least in theory, that there's no evidence for end of the world scenarios. The world's going to go on. Even after we die, believe it or not, the world will go on. And there's no evidence that because you failed at jobs in the past, this proves that you're going to fail in the future. It shows that you better learn some interview skills and some job skills and do better, but you're not fated to failure forever. So that is the process. Now, to draw that out a little more clearly, Albert Ellis devised an ABC theory of emotion. A stands for activating event. In this case, I was fired. I'm unemployed. C, we'll skip B for a minute. C stands for undesirable emotional consequence. I'm depressed. So at A, I got fired, the situation, the event. At C, I feel depressed. But now you know it's never A that causes C. It's never the activating event, the adversity, that causes any emotion in you at C, but rather it's B. B is your irrational belief, such as, I should not have gotten fired. This proves I'm a loser. I'm a worthless failure. So it's B that causes C, always, never A. Now, when you're looking for your B, there are 3 fundamental irrational beliefs you can look at, or 3 fundamental demands which cause undesirable emotions. And the first one is a demand on oneself, and that leads to anxiety, depression, shame, embarrassment, guilt, jealousy, a whole host of undesirable emotions, which means emotions that eat you up inside and you'd be better off without. And that the basic or general form of that belief is, because I prefer to do well and get approval, therefore I absolutely must. I have to. And if I don't do well, or I'm disapproved of or rejected, as I am in this case, that proves I'm no good. The second demand, or irrational belief, is not a demand on oneself, but rather a demand on others, and that causes anger, resentment, and hostility, and that the belief takes the form of, because I prefer that you treat me well, therefore you absolutely must treat me kindly, caringly, reasonably, reciprocally, understandingly, clearly, consistently. And if you don't treat me that way, you're no good, you're a rotten person, and you deserve to roast in hell. And I just appointed myself your roaster. So at least in my head, I tell myself what an awful person you are and how nice it would be if you roasted in hell for all eternity. The third and final demand is not a demand on the conditions. It's not a demand on oneself or others. It's an impersonal demand. It's a demand on the conditions of one's life, and that takes the form of, because I prefer life be fair, easy, and hassle-free, therefore it absolutely must be fair, easy, and hassle-free. And if it's not, if life gives me problems or throws obstacles in my way or frustrations, this is awful, my life is horrible, and I'm going to be miserable forever. So those are the three main demands. So when you're disturbed, anxious, depressed, angry, jealous, or you act in a self-defeating way, procrastinating, acting addictively, look for your must, and that's often the third must, a demand on the conditions of one's life, leading to escaping these unfair or difficult situations through procrastination or addiction. So those are the main musts that people have. And one of the main reasons why my book is called 3-Minute Therapy is that once you learn this method, you can practice it, that ABC that I told you about, practice it on a regular basis every day, usually by writing it out. And then you would add D, E, and F to it. D stands for disputing or questioning the irrational belief. For example, what is the evidence I must never lose my job? What is the evidence I'm a loser because I lost my job? And that leads to E, effective new thinking or effective new philosophy, such as, although I passionately prefer to keep this job, there's no law of the universe saying I have to. It is very frustrating to be out of work, but not the end of the world. I've survived being unemployed before, and I'll survive in the future. I don't like this situation, but I definitely can stand what I don't like. And it's not the situation itself that causes my depression, but rather it's my unrealistic thinking about it. And with practice, I can change my thinking, uproot my musts and shoulds, and learn to unconditionally accept adversity in life, although I'll never like having it. Then once you internalize that, which takes practice and reinforcement and repetition, that leads to F, your new feeling, which would be very frustrated, very concerned, very displeased and disappointed, but not depressed. You'd be concerned, displeased, frustrated about the situation, but not putting yourself down as a total person. Then you practice that 3-minute exercise on a regular basis, And as you do it, as you think through the irrational beliefs, question, challenge, and go over them again and again and again, then just like learning anything else, the more you practice something that makes sense, the more it gets into your brain and you begin to internalize it. So in a nutshell, that's what I teach my clients. And there are various subtleties to it and individual differences and things like that. So that's what we discuss in therapy. And then there are practical aspects to it, what you could do about getting a job, or good ways to occupy your time, or things like that. So there you have it, rational emotive behavior therapy. Now, I have a YouTube channel called the REBT Advocates, which has now about almost 90 interviews or discussions with my REBT partner, Tommy Bateman. And so you can look at those on YouTube and learn more about REBT. You can read my books. I have 3 books, the best of which, as was mentioned, is 3-Minute Therapy, which is comprehensive and has 14 chapters applying this approach to different problems. And you can also read books by Albert Ellis. Albert Ellis, the genius, wrote over 80 books and are very instructive. And you can use these books as self-therapy. And also, if you go to YouTube and put in Albert Ellis, you'll find many of his talks. Although he died at the age of 93 in 2007, so most of the YouTubes are not of today's quality, but they're certainly very understandable and very, very useful. So there are all these resources that you can use to learn about this. And then there are REBT therapists like myself who practice REBT in person, phone, and Skype. So those are also options. So that's pretty much it. Are there any questions or other things you'd like me to address?
Well, let's see. We're going to open it up. Everybody that has a question, if you'll use that raise your hand icon, I'll take a slot of calling on you there. I would ask you though, just as a little point of reference, since you've been at this such a long time, I would say that if we took just about anybody you care to grab and put their hand over a flame, they're going to jerk their hand back because they don't want to leave it there over that fire.
Right.
Yet you said that some people, if they get fired, a certain measure will be like, well, that's the best news I heard since yesterday. And others are all upset about it. Why are we not all equally reacting the exact same way?
Yeah, very good. And that's, again, because of their thinking. If someone is a fire eater, they might love to deal with the fire and swallow the fire, those kinds of things. So different people have different personalities. There are great individual differences between people, and they have different views, different perspectives on situations based on their genetic predispositions, their upbringing, and their current views on things. So I think that's a very good example of how it's our thinking that causes our emotions. Now, I do want to say that people sometimes get the wrong impression of what I'm saying. I'm not saying it's easy to change your thinking. Just because your emotions are caused by your thinking, that doesn't mean once you realize that, you're cured. Sometimes it's very difficult to change your thinking. For example, if you were brutally treated as a child and now you're depressed about it, there's thinking that goes on that causes your depression. It's not the brutal treatment, but it may not be that easy to change your thinking. But you have a handle by looking at your thinking that's causing you depression now about a situation that's long gone to start changing your depression or hopelessness about that.
As the person gets better control of the situation based on what you're doing there, is there like a less likelihood they need to be on medications or anything of that nature?
Oh, yes, very good question. As people get more control of their thinking, they often can taper off their medication, but not necessarily. I do have clients who are on medication and supplement it with the therapy, rational emotive behavior therapy. There are other people who taper off, and then there are those people who aren't interested in medication at all. They just want to work on changing their thinking. So again, this illustrates individual differences.
But and in those individuals where there's trying to use this but still need to have medication, I mean, what's the situation that they still need that medication? Is it just a biological issue, or is it, like a mental predisposition? There's just no way you can break that that ingrained little way that they're functioning?
I wouldn't say that there's no way, but I think with people on medication and using RABT, that their irrational thinking is very deeply ingrained, which means they have a greater genetic predisposition to think irrationally than the average person. And very good examples of that are people with psychotic disorders like bipolar, which used to be called manic depressive disorder, or schizophrenics. With those two categories, unless they're on medication to stabilize their thinking, so their thinking isn't all over the place, then the RABT won't help. But I've helped people with diagnoses like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder when they're on their medication and they work hard at practicing these 3-minute exercises, reading the books, and reinforcing the ideas again and again and again.
Excellent. Paul, I see your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. It was a great presentation, by the way. I think a lot of this information can be very useful. I, in particular, tend to worry quite a bit about things just generally. So it's interesting. The question I had, well, and I don't know if it's a comment or question, but I assume that the feedback technique of kind of constantly reminding yourself, being consciously aware, of worrying without evidence, so to speak, conditionally, is part of the therapy, correct? I mean, you're basically trying to kind of condition yourself to look more objectively at things. Is that right? Or
Yes, that's exactly right. And that's a very good question. The reason thinking more rationally tends to help is because, as you said, you're thinking more objectively, more in line with reality. And the further out of line reality, your view of reality is, often, not always, but often, the more disturbed your emotions will be. So yes, a task of this therapy is thinking about things more objectively as subjective individuals. No one's 100% objective, but you can get closer to reality by using these strategies and thereby feeling better.
right? Yeah, it's kind of like the old adage. There's nothing to fear but fear itself. As they said, in a way, would you agree? Or
Yes. In fact, I bring up this quote with clients, and that particularly illustrates what I call secondary disturbance. And I have a chapter in my book, 3-Minute Therapy, about secondary disturbance. And what secondary disturbance is, as you said, is fear of fear, or anxiety about anxiety, or depression about depression, or depression about anxiety. So first you have an emotional problem like fear. You fear the snake, and then you get yourself anxious about having that fear. Or a more common one these days is you fear public speaking. That's very common, fear or phobia. And then when you think about that public speaking date coming up, then you get anxious about being anxious at the public speaking. So the first step is to get over the secondary disturbance, of secondary fear. Don't have that fear about fear, And the way to do that is the same way that I already described. You identify your irrational beliefs that's causing your fear of fear, which is often something like, I must not get anxious when I give the talk. I must not block, stutter, or be inarticulate because of my anxiety. I must not appear anxious to the audience, etc. I must not have a panic attack while I'm giving the talk. So you have a must about the emotional problem, creating the second emotional problem, the fear of the fear. So the first step is to work on accepting the fact that humans easily make themselves anxious, and presumably you're human, so you're going to get anxious at times. And then, so that means unconditionally accepting your disturbed emotions, anxiety, depression, or anger. That doesn't mean liking it. Accepting doesn't mean liking it. Accepting means you recognize this is a reality for now. It's not the end of the world. There's no reason it should or has to be otherwise. And then you have a degree of acceptance and less fear of fear. And then you can work on the primary anxiety and work at uprooting that also. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think that's liberating too. To take that mindset is liberating, because
Right.
you're not as entrapped, as
Exactly.
you would be.
Exactly. The fear of fear, your anxiety, the secondary anxiety entraps you or encapsulates the primary one and often magnifies it. And so you find once you get over the secondary anxiety and accept the fact you're allowed to feel anxious, there's no law written anywhere by the government yet that you can't feel anxious. The more you accept that, then the more the primary anxiety tends to diminish, also because the secondary is magnifying the primary, and it encapsulates the secondary, encapsulates that, isolates that, and magnifies it.
Yeah, and I must say, I'm starting to grow into more of a libertarian, which I'm sure Charles and Jeff would probably like to hear that. But I think that this I think that this kind of philosophy, it goes into that vein. So yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I have libertarian clients. Unfortunately, they tend to be on the saner side, so they take to this philosophy very quickly. And I mean, unfortunately for my business anyway. So it's not a long stretch of therapy. They get it pretty quickly and help themselves pretty quickly. On that note, I could say that some clients I have get the message immediately. It really clicks. They're a small percentage. And then there are others at the other end who come for many, many, many sessions, but the average is about 8 to 10 sessions. And I teach you to be your own therapist. I teach you these methods we've been discussing, and I teach you how to work on these problems on your own. You can learn to identify your irrational thinking pretty quickly, question, challenge, and contradict them on a regular basis. And then you're your own therapist. You know how to do it, all the steps. And we don't have to ask you to lie on a Freudian couch for 10 years and discuss your dreams, your free associations in your childhood, but we just look at the immediate cause of your problems, not something that may have happened 50 years ago, but your immediate cause, your thinking, and help you change that. And no matter what happened when you were a child, if you had great parents or very critical parents, if you change your thinking now, that makes all the difference in your current emotions.
Do you do any training with the patients as far as how they deal with their spouse? Because I got to imagine in a lot of couples, one's fixated on this issue and the other one's like, why do you even care about that? Quit thinking
Right.
about it, kind of an attitude.
Exactly. Yeah, I have.
And they're not really supportive. They're almost dismissive. It's like you're silly to be thinking about that.
Yeah, very good question. In fact, I have a couple now, and I had the wife this morning, and that's pretty much what she was discussing and what she was having a problem with her husband. And so I do deal with couples. I teach the couples this approach, and I teach them some skills also, like better communication skills and ways to support the relationship more. So that's very helpful. And I also work with one partner. If the other one, for some reason, isn't available or doesn't want to come in for therapy, I work with one partner to help him or her and teach them to teach their partner some of these methods. So
Sure.
when you learn this, you can help not only yourself, but you can help others, your relatives, your friends, strangers, anyone who is interested in listening to the basic ideas.
Sure. Very good. David, I saw you had your hand up.
Thank you, Jeff. Michael, this is David Demers with Roads to Freedom Foundation in Omaha. A little background, I came from a family with good intellectual tools, but they wouldn't know a feeling or an emotion if it hit them square between the eyes. So during a midlife crisis, my family doctor recommended some counseling. So years ago, I got some assertive behavior training, which from my perspective included stress management, conflict resolution, negotiation, reassurance substitute behavior. So I developed a reassurance mantra that was helpful. And of course, back in 1962, I read Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, and her philosophy of objectivism was a big help. So what are your thoughts on assertive behavior training?
Oh, yes, I think that's very good. I think the various things you just mentioned, David, are all very helpful, and I'm glad that you found a therapist who could teach you that, including assertiveness training, because often in couples, one person might be very unassertive. They don't express their opinions. They expect the other one to know what they want instead of expressing it. And then on the other side, there are people who don't know how to be assertive. They get angry and aggressive instead. So assertiveness training, as you're indicating, is often very useful with couples and individuals. Anyone who deals with people, which is all of us, is a very helpful thing. Now, if you don't have any questions, more questions specifically on that, I wanted to say something about Ayn Rand, since you brought her
Sure.
up.
Yeah, it'd be a great diversion.
Yeah. Okay. So Ayn Rand has a lot of good ideas about psychology, and one of the main ones is it's our thinking that's doing us in, not our childhood or anything like that. But one of her very bad ideas is her idea about self-esteem, and her acolyte, or her assistant, whatever you want to call him, Nathaniel Branden, was a psychologist who wrote many books on self-esteem and discussed how wonderful self-esteem is. And I've debated on YouTube various Randians about self-esteem. And I also, years ago, I had an email debate actually with Nathaniel Branden about this. And I have a totally different view of self-esteem. I think it's unempirical, illogical, and unpragmatic. Otherwise, I love it. And and the problem with self-esteem is if you have high self-esteem, normally that means you feel good about yourself. And the way you get to feel good about yourself is you're rating your behaviors, and then overgeneralizing of the rating of your behavior to the rating of yourself. So suppose I have a good job and I've written many good books, and I tell myself all these things that I've done well in life means I'm a good person, then I have high self-esteem. So at first I rate what I'm doing, which I think is important. I'm not throwing out all judgment. I think it's important to judge your actions and judge other people's actions, but then don't overgeneralize to your total self, because you're never a good or a bad person. You're just an imperfect human who acts imperfectly. No matter how well you do, you're going to screw up at times. And no matter how poorly you do, you're going to do well at times. So to rate your total self, to give your essence, your being, your personhood, a rating, good or bad, based on your behavior makes no sense. Another reason is humans are a process. We're not a product. We're always changing. So we could do, well, I could do a good interview today and then blow it in my interview tomorrow, or I could get fired today and learn more skills and be a better interviewee and get a good job tomorrow. So to take your behaviors and freeze them in stone and say that's the total me, or the evaluation of that is the evaluation of the total me, makes no sense. Therefore, the solution to the self-esteem problem that I recommend is called unconditional self-acceptance. You accept yourself unconditionally as an imperfect human, a fallible, flawed human, which you always have been and you always will be, not a good or bad person, a human who at times does well, at times does poorly. Some people like, some people don't like, and you can always improve on these things if you want to. So it's good to rate your behaviors, because if you rate your behaviors poorly, then that tells you to look for how you can improve. If you rate your behavior as good, that's important, because that tells you how you can maintain or continue to improve. But if you rate your total self, that doesn't give you a direction to go in, and you wind up anxiously trying to prove yourself, to prove to everyone and yourself you're the good person you think you are, rather than trying to enjoy yourself, be productive, get along with people, and do good things for yourself and others in life. Does that make sense, David? Did you have a different view from Ayn Rand?
Actually, it does make sense. So, frankly, I was more focused on her economic positions, and I enjoyed her view of romantic literature. I took her view and Brandon's view of self-esteem under advisement. Somewhat helpful, but I'm inclined to agree with your approach.
Okay, good, very good. So go with unconditional self-acceptance, rate your behaviors, but never rate yourself, because it's, as I said, it's very unhelpful, self-destructive, and it doesn't help you improve your life.
And it gets you into trouble if you get out of control on rating yourself based on political standards and some of that nonsense. So
Yeah.
I'm with you on that.
Yeah, good point. I didn't even mention that. It gets you into trouble, because if you think you're a good person and then these other slobs have stupid political beliefs, you feel better than them. I'm better than you. I'm a good person. You're an idiot. And it's hard to relate to them, talk to them, and try to persuade them out of their idiocy. And you're more likely to be hostile, angry toward them, because they don't see it the right way, the way you do, of course. So it does get you into trouble.
It's good.
Excellent.
You're kind of really describing, as I'm listening, you guys go back and forth. You're really describing the reality of what, instead of esteem, it's really just about having confidence. I know who I am. I know my limitations. And if I feel I'm trying to do the right thing, if I consistently feel like that and tried in that direction, that's confidence. So my esteem, I'm not trying to gauge against something or make a measuring stick. Because like you said, once you start doing that, then it's, I'm better than you and this and that, whatever. So confidence allows me to win the day by my argument, because I'm confident in my position.
Exactly. I like that distinction. You're confident in your position, not in your total self.
Right.
Because you're imperfect, you're going to screw up. So it makes no sense
Yeah.
to be 100% confident in you. And that is called task confidence rather than self-confidence. So I have task confidence in doing therapy and helping people, but I have no task confidence in helping people with their finances, because that's not a strong area of mine. So have task confidence, but not self-confidence.
That's excellent. Charles, I see you've had your hand up for a bit there.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. And Dr. Edelstein, fantastic. I love the back and forth with the participants and the questions. I have several questions, and Jeff, you can go to others and come back to me. But sort of building off of things you've already said, you mentioned Brandon and objectivism and self-esteem. What about the other great liberty-minded psychologist icon, Thomas Szasz, the late Thomas Szasz? How do you compare with his approach? I think these comparisons kind of help us understand where you're coming from too.
Right. Now, with Thomas Szasz and with the objectivists, we all agree on a central point. It's not your childhood, it's your thinking now that causes your problems. And then we go off a little. Thomas Szasz had this idea about mental illness. He wrote a book, I think his first book, and a very popular book, was called The Myth of Mental Illness. And his idea is mental illness is a myth. Now, if you take it literally, the term mental illness, you could make the case it's a myth, or there are arguments against that, which if you're interested, I'll go into. But generally, mental illness normally means, in lay terms, emotional disturbance. If I am anxious, then in a way I have a mental illness. I don't like the term mental illness. I never use it. But I have a mental disturbance, which some people call an illness. But it's a mental disturbance, and that's real. Now, another difference is Thomas Szasz believed that people's emotional problems came from not understanding the rules of the game. So it would be like you're playing baseball and then you grab the ball and start running for the end of the diamond instead of hitting the ball because you're confused. You're playing football rather than baseball. So his idea of therapy that I understood, although I never exactly saw a transcript of him doing therapy, but from what he said was that the way to help people is teach them the rules so they understand the rules. So if you see a friend and you don't say anything positive to them, you don't say hello, and you just start criticizing them, your problem is you don't understand the rules. The rules of social interaction is to be positive, say hello when you meet someone, say goodbye when you leave them, etc. Don't just spend the time criticizing them. So you don't understand the rules. And then he teaches you the rules. So that's his idea as I understand it. And so that's different from what I believe. It's not understanding the rules. You can misunderstand the rules and not be disturbed about it. If I am playing baseball and I use football rules, that doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to be anxious or depressed. It means I better learn the rules. But my anxiety and depression about everyone playing a different game than me comes from I must. I must not be an outcast. I must be in line with everyone else, or they must understand that I can grab the ball and run for a touchdown in a baseball game. So I'm resentful toward them for not understanding. So it seems to me teaching the rules is a good practice as a therapist, but it's more dealing with a practical problem rather than with their emotional problem.
Very good, Jeff. Should I continue, or do you have others with their hand up?
No, go right ahead for a minute.
So the two other questions I have deals with a comment earlier. You were talking about confidence or something. Being nervous about public speaking, and you have that book, Stage Fright. Let's talk about that for a bit more, because we always have to be social with others, selling, presenting. We can't escape speaking to the public in some fashion. So you have some quick rules on stage fright, overcoming that?
Yes. And it's interesting to note that stage fright or fear of public speaking is the most common fear that people have, even more common than the fear of something like death. So it's endemic to people. So it's not unusual that people who are going to be asked to speak in public feel anxious. Now, often with stage fright, there's a secondary disturbance there. Now you have an idea of a secondary disturbance. People realize they're going to be anxious, especially when they first start public speaking, and then they get anxious about that. So the solution is first identifying what's causing your anxiety, which is not being anxious when you give the talk, but it's you're thinking about being anxious when you give the talk, and it's demands, some of those demands I mentioned earlier. I must not be anxious. I must do a great job calmly. I must have everyone's approval. I must not appear anxious. I must not have a panic attack or have blocks due to my anxiety. So those are usually some of the musts. And then I help people question, challenge, and contradict those musts. And also, REBT is not only a therapy that uses cognitive techniques, as I've been discussing, but it uses behavioral techniques and emotive and imaging techniques. So I have a strategy called 3-minute imagery. And as an aside, I just want to mention that all these ideas that I'm promulgating today, I got from Albert Ellis. So I'm not the genius Albert Ellis is. I'm just a good transmitter of his ideas. So 3-minute imagery, briefly, is where you picture the feared situation, such as feeling anxious giving the talk, or the worst case scenario, people throwing rotten tomatoes at you, or you're faint, or you stutter. You picture that, and then you practice saying rational statements to yourself, such as, it's unfortunate that they're throwing rotten tomatoes, but not the end of the world. I don't like it, but I can stand what I don't like. I can learn what I am doing wrong and do better next time. And I don't absolutely need their approval. I don't need what I prefer. I prefer that they think I'm giving a great talk, but I don't absolutely need that. So that's the imagery. And I have some examples of that in my book, 3-Minute Therapy, and in my book, Stage Fright. And then another strategy is successive approximations. This is more of a behavioral strategy where you practice giving talks to a few people. So you get your friends together and give a talk to them. Or one very common, very useful thing is Toastmasters. There are Toastmasters groups all around the country, and their goal is to help you be a better speaker, in terms of practical strategies to be a better speaker. And usually it's a small group, and there's no charge, or there might be a small membership fee. And you go to these meetings and you practice speaking, and then they give you feedback on how you could do better as a speaker. So that helps you with the practical problem. But so the solution is thinking, changing your thinking, and then doing, practicing. So you get better and less anxious.
And Jeff, unless someone else has a question, my final question has to deal with money, which you said you weren't very good at. You were better at therapy. People have to pay you. And one topic you and I discussed before was the desire of folks not to see therapists too many times because they can't afford it. Maybe there's limits in their insurance, or they don't have much discretionary income. So I brought up the health savings account that we promote, or this money doubling medical benefit savings account that replenishes funds more vigorously so they can visit the therapist more often. How much a barrier is it for the therapists that you know out there in the marketplace with patients who just don't have the money to get the regularity that they need with therapy? And how important is it to find those funds to be a regular customer for those who really need the help? You said libertarians and others don't need a lot of help, but a lot of folks do. There seems to be lots of articles about that. So talk about that a bit.
Sure. That's a good question. And my advice is largely for the clients who can't afford therapy rather than for the therapists. And if you can't afford the fees of therapists, there are various ways to deal with that. One is there's a website called OpenPath. And if you go on OpenPath and become a member, uh, they will ask you what your income is or what your finances is. And if you qualify, then you are referred to therapists who work with OpenPath. And in that case, the fee is just $60, which is much lower than the usual therapy fees. So, and I'm on OpenPath also. So you join OpenPath, and then if you find my bio and you like it, you call me, and if we're a good fit, then I see you for just $60 rather than from my usual fee. And speaking of my usual fee, there are therapists like myself who have sliding scales. So I have a top fee of $270 for people who are doing okay financially. A bottom fee is $150 for people having financial difficulties. So if you and then I just ask you, I don't ask for any documentation, IRS forms, or anything like that. I just ask you at the first session, what seems like a fair and reasonable rate for you. And then you tell me. I just had a client who said, I have a great inheritance, 270. And I have other clients at the other end who say I'm unemployed or things like that, 150. And then that's your fee. Also, there are groups around the country called Smart Recovery, and you can find out more about that at smartrecovery.org. And these are self-help groups for people with addictions, and there's no charge. And you can go to these groups, discuss your problems with other people with addictions for no charge at all, and they teach you some of these strategies. Then, as I alluded to, there are many books, YouTubes of mine, Albert Ellis, many other REBT therapists who tell you how to deal with different problems. And I've gotten emails actually from around the world from people who said, I read your book, 3-Minute Therapy. It was great. It got me over my panic attacks, or I'm much less depressed now using those strategies. So that's another free way to access therapy and help yourself dramatically. So those are some of the various methods people could use who can't afford the usual therapist fee.
Very nice. David, we got time for one last question.
So I found Toastmasters quite helpful on the issue of stage fright, but just as important to me, having something that I'm passionate about, which usually is innovative ideas. And I found that just getting out there, just as the same as my approach for writing, just start talking or just start writing and see what comes out. And I was pleasantly surprised. So that step combined with some Toastmaster technique was helpful. Now, along those lines, I have a libertarian friend, Robin Kerner, who wrote the book Weapons of Mass Persuasion. And he addresses, well, he takes issue with how most libertarians try to convince other people. So are you familiar with that book and his approach to changing how we attempt to persuade others?
I think that's a very interesting and important topic for us, how to persuade others. And many years ago in the libertarian movement, there was a very articulate, popular libertarian named Marshall Fritz. Anyone ever hear of him?
Marshall, sure. The Advocates for Self-Government.
Exactly. He started the Advocates for Self-Government. And he had this idea, which caught on among libertarians at the time, about there's a personality test called the Myers-Briggs Inventory. And has anyone heard of that? The Myers-Briggs Inventory?
Love
Yes. Yep.
Oh yeah, everyone knows that.
Yeah. Oh, good.
What they call the diamond chart now.
Yeah. I think it's my understanding it's different from the diamond chart. But the Myers-Briggs Inventory, you take a pencil and paper test where you answer questions, and at the end of it, they tell you what kind of personality you have. Are you the intuitive type, or an extrovert, or the introvert? And Marshall Fritz and some others were giving talks and workshops on using this personality typing to persuade libertarians. The idea being, if you are giving a talk to one group that has a particular personality type, or an individual has a particular personality type in this taxonomy, you tailor your talk to them. But that's been largely abandoned, as far as I know, among libertarians, because there's not much evidence that you're going to be more persuasive in doing that. And it doesn't seem to work. So that's not the best way. So I hope what you're referring to, this book and this approach, doesn't rely heavily on that. Did you read the book, and could you say a couple of things about what is recommended?
I'm still coming to grips with everything Robin has to say, basically because of time constraints. But so I'm not prepared to spell out his approach. You'd probably be better off taking a look at it yourself and see what you think.
Yeah, I could say a couple of things about persuading people, since I try to do a good bit of it myself over the years, because I like to proselytize ideas that I think are good ones.
Sure, please do. Let's use that as a closing comments here.
Okay, I think a very important thing is to define your terms and get the person you're speaking with to define their terms. Otherwise, you might be talking past each other. And a very good example is capitalism. So you speak to a lefty about capitalism. They don't like capitalism. You like capitalism. And then after many, many conversations, you find out you're talking about two different things. They're talking about corporatism, which they're calling capitalism, and you're talking about free market capitalism, and you're against corporatism also, so you really agree on that. But if you define your terms, the critical terms at first, then you'll be on the same page much sooner and have more mileage in doing that. Another thing early in the stages is try to make sure you understand their perspective, because just as with 10 libertarians, everyone has a different definition of liberty. With 10 socialists, everyone has a different definition of socialism. So if they're hawking socialism, you want to get details about what they mean about that and understanding what they mean about that before you can really speak with them effectively. So that's very important. And then another thing is try not to argue. In a sense, you are going to be arguing with them, but try not to argue with them in an overly critical way. So when they express an opinion, show them you understand what they're saying before you criticize them. And let them talk, don't interrupt. And if you find they're long-winded, then say, well, let's have an agreement that when each of us talk, we don't talk for more than 2 minutes or something like that. Or we observe the traffic light rule. Marty Nemko, who's a prodigious Psychology Today blogger and has written many books, has this traffic light rule, which is for the first 30 seconds, your light is green, so talk, explain your position. For the next 30 seconds, your light is orange, so start to wind down. And then after 60 seconds, the light is red, so stop talking, pause, let the other person get a word in edgewise or ask questions, and then you have more of a give and take. So I would say those are some of the principles in persuading people.
That's very consistent with assertive behavior, number one, and entirely consistent with the approach that Robin Kerner takes.
Oh, good, good, very good, very good.
So there you go. Well, there we got a nice conclusion there. Well, I want to definitely thank you so much for being here today. It was very informative and certainly helps kind of clear the air on some of what you see when you see what's going on around yourself and people's frustrations and so on. So again, thanks so much for being here today.
You're welcome. Thanks for inviting me. I enjoyed this, and you all had great questions, which helped me elucidate my opinions and my approach. So I found it very good to do this. Thank you very much. If you ever want to have me back again, I'll be happy to do so and speak some more.
We will certainly take advantage of that with you for sure. Thanks again.